I'm Lydia Rackham, and we are doing a study in the Bible of individual prayers, starting at the beginning and going to the end with some things out of order, just depending upon where the inspiration strikes. So, we last time we were talking about Jacob who wrestled with God, and then there's kind of a big gap of specific prayers. So I'm not saying that people didn't talk to God, but it's just not anything specific. All the way Joseph, we know he talked to God, but there's just nothing that he written down that he specifically said. So we don't know Joseph. So Isaac had Jacob and Esau. Jacob took the birthright and the blessing from his big brother, and he became Israel. And the chosen people. So he inherited the promise that came from Abraham. And he and his wives had a competition. His wives had a competition, see how many babies they could have. And so they had a whole bunch of babies. And so they had altogether 12 sons. And obviously Joseph got, he had visions of what his life was going to be like, and his brothers were very envious of that, so they threw him in a hole, and then they sold him to some people who were heading to Egypt. And then when Joseph was only 17, he got sold in Egypt, but everywhere he went in Egypt, he didn't allow bitterness to get a hold of him. He just remembered the visions that God had given him, and he kept the faith, and it was rewarded in a sudden switch. An overnight switch. He went from the dungeon to the palace, and he was second in command to Pharaoh. And he saved all of Egypt and most of the world from a terrible famine that probably would have killed everybody. And his brothers and his father wound up coming down to Egypt in search of food, and they were reunited with Joseph, and they decided to stay there in the land of Goshen, which was grazing country. But then, so years pass. They have a lot of kids. Those brothers have a lot of kids. Joseph only had 2. But Ephraim and Manasseh, the others, they had kids and more kids and more kids, and they stayed in Egypt. Then a dynasty came about where they didn't remember, after Joseph died, they didn't remember what Joseph had done for Egypt. So new management. And you know how that goes in lots of cases. In cases of like kings and queens switching over, in cases of presidential administration switching over, they fire everybody who was there before, and they want to do things their way. And so this new Pharaoh was like, I don't even care about all that stuff that happened before. And in fact, I don't like these Jews because they're not like us. They're not Egyptian, and they're not doing our customs. They're not worshiping our gods. So they're hairy. You haven't even noticed how Egyptians don't like hair. They shave all their hair off, and then they put like wigs on and stuff. But even the women, their hair is like shaved, and then they have a wig made of these beautiful braids, but they don't want to have hair. Egyptians don't have the beard that they wear, that strap thing. They don't like hair. And Jews are the opposite. Jews like the long beard and things like that. And the Egyptians were like, this is not my style. I don't like them. And they herd sheep, and we don't like that. That's stinky and dirty. So this new Pharaoh decided to enslave them, and enslaved them for a really long time. But they got to be very numerous, still having lots of babies. And then eventually another Pharaoh was like, there's too many of them, let's kill them. So they killed a bunch of babies. They threw the baby boys in the Nile. And but Moshe, his parents sensed that God had a plan for this baby. And so they hid him, and then they put him in a basket and stuck him kind of in the reeds. in my reading of it, it's not quite like in the Prince of Egypt where she pushed him out into the water and it like got pushed around by boats and things. What it seems is that she just kind of stuck him in the reeds. Like she just stuck him in the reeds. It wasn't out in the open water. It was like here, right by the bank. And then strategically in a very populated area. And then where there were women, Egyptian women. So that was a strategy, I think. And then obviously Pharaoh's daughter heard the crying and went and got him and was like, oh, look, I think I'll keep him for a pet, basically. So he was raised to be Pharaoh's daughter's kid, but apparently he knew what he was because later when he was a young man, he saw two Jews fighting. No, he saw a Egyptian beating a Jewish person. So he killed the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. And then later he sees two Jews fighting each other and he's like, what are you doing? Stop it. And they're like, what are you going to do? Kill us too? And so he's like, oh, shoot, they know. And so Pharaoh found out and he was going to kill Moshe. So Moshe ran away and became a shepherd in the land of Midian, got married, had a couple kids, and that's where he is. Running away, fugitive, murderer. People don't like to remember that about Moses, but that he's a murderer, killed somebody. Yeah. Murdered the Egyptian. I guess he paid for it by having to be exiled, but yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, so the prayer we're dealing with today is during that long period, the king of Egypt died. So that's the king of Egypt that was after Moshe. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. So it says during that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. So we just naturally assume that the Israelites have been crying out this whole time. And so then it seems sort of callous that God only now is like, oh yeah, those poor people, kind of worried about them, wondered what had happened to them. It kind of makes God seem like the absent-minded professor or something. Like, oh yeah, whatever. And that's not the case. That's never the case. So it seems to me that it's clear from the text that this is when the Israelites, this period here, when Moses left, that is when the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. None of the time before did they cry out to God. And I think that happens a lot. I think that people groan a lot and they express pain, and they can do that for a really long time before they actually cry out to God. They can try everything else. They can talk to all the other people around them. They can search for other solutions. They can Google it to death. They can, do all of these things before they reach the end of the rope, and then they go, Lord, help. Also, the fact that they became enslaved is interesting because people ask, I know he asked it, Peter asked it in The Chosen, how come you let us be enslaved in Egypt for 430 years? Well, why were you in Egypt? See, they went there because of the famine, but the famine didn't last for 400 years. But Israel got comfortable in Egypt, which was not the promised land. Abraham had taken a little vacation to Egypt during a famine. Isaac did that too, but they went back. But the problem here with Jacob and his family is they didn't go back. They stayed in Egypt, which was not the promised land. And it's like, because it was so comfortable there, they were living high on the hog. And they had this ideal place. They had the favor of the royalty. They preferred the favor of Pharaoh to the promises of God. Egypt was already settled. It was already, very prosperous, wealthy. Canaan was not, it was kind of filled with people that had religions that were very savage compared to Egyptians, who their religion is very clean and peaceful. Whereas the people in Canaan were like, sacrifice the babies, burn people alive, like they were just really horrible. So I could see why I don't like my neighbors. You talk about not liking your neighbors. Ugh. So they got very comfortable in Egypt and they wouldn't leave. They're kind of like the guests that won't leave. Like, yeah, we told you could come in 3 weeks ago. Go away. And I think maybe that was part of, the new Pharaoh's thing was like, who are these people? These aren't Egyptians. Get out. So God allowed the Israelites to be made very uncomfortable so that they no longer wanted to stay in Egypt. And the slavery got worse and worse and worse. See, they probably didn't start out by rounding them up because that would be a revolt, but what would happen is probably they just pass an edict and say, and take away rights. They'd take away their rights. They'd take away various rights. They start confiscating their land, say, well, you don't have that anymore. And if you want to live, you have to hire yourself out as a servant. And so like, okay, I'm going to hire myself out as a servant. And then you did that, but then pretty soon there's no wages. There's only like food. They only feed you and then have a place to sleep. And basically then you're a slave. It wouldn't just happen all of a sudden, because really, if you tried to enslave suddenly a multitude like that, it would be very violent and very upheaval-ish. And it doesn't say that happened. So it probably was this gradual thing. That's how most people get sucked into slavery and captivity and things like addictions and stuff. It was just like this slow slide into it. And then all of a sudden they look up and they're going, wait a minute, I couldn't leave if I wanted to. I can't leave. I belong to someone. Someone bought me, or they bought my kids. They bought them. So, God allowed them to become extremely uncomfortable in Egypt because that's not where he wanted them to be. He wanted them to be in the promised land in Canaan. But they had left Canaan, they left the promised land, and they had settled in a place where they weren't supposed to be. And so now, this is what you get. Looking to the hospitality and the goodwill and the favor of a king that is not your God. He will turn on you. This earthly king will turn on you, and that'll be it. It's kind of like a precursor to, are you sure you want a king, guys? This is what he can do. Just like that, on a whim, he can take away your life. take away everything. So, and it took him that long, all this suffering, to finally go, this is so bad. We can't save ourselves. We've also just had a whole generation of our men, potential men, like they were little baby boys. They were all killed. So that was really horrible. So now we are crying out to a God we barely remember. Because that would have just been stories passed down from Jacob and his children, because God hadn't done anything or said anything for that whole time. So they just know about God, but they haven't seen anything, no prophet has come, no visions, no angels, no nothing. Just the story of the ancestral God that took them into this promised land and elevated Joseph so that they could be saved in Egypt. Kind of very vague. And a lot of them probably at this point were illiterate, the slave mind, and they were just crying out to the only hope that they knew of, because they weren't going to pray to the Egyptian gods. So, and then it said God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then we've gone over that remember again. It's not like, it's constantly been in his mind, and then it sort of swells to the forefront. It's not that. It's like I rest this next action I take upon my covenant that I made. I remember it. It's like saying, of course I remember your birthday. As in, I take action upon it. I always do. I always send you a card on your birthday. Always, my whole life I do this. I remember it. It's not, I remember. Oh yeah, I remember. It's, no, I remember this. I do this in remembrance. It sounds, like in memorial. I memorialize my covenant. So, and then he's got Moses already. Interesting that you always notice that a lot of the best leaders that God pulls out are shepherds. Abraham. I believe Isaac does sheeping out in the field. Jacob had a lot of flocks. Joseph, flocks. And Moses, shepherd. And David. And then the angels appeared to shepherds at Jesus' birth. And he calls himself the good shepherd. There's lots of sheep. A lot of the best leaders of Israel came from shepherds. Should have been the signal that Saul wasn't quite the best, because King Saul, because he was looking for donkeys, not sheep. Lost donkeys, but they were not cheap. David. So that's just an interesting thing to note and to think about. Why would he make you be a shepherd first before you were to be a leader? There's this, there's a series that I like to watch. It's called Victorian Farm. And they have several. They have Victorian Farm and Edwardian Farm and Christmas on the Victorian Farm, and they have Wartime Farm. But they're always out there doing livestock. And they have a shepherd guy on there, and he's like, the sheep is the only animal in God's creation looking for the quickest way to die. Like that. They're just like, is there a cliff? Ah. Oh, is there some barbed wire I can get caught in? Oh, is there a way I can flip over and then I can't get up? Yeah. So they're like that. Sheep are like that. They are the worst at trying to keep alive. You have to be constantly watching them because they do stupid things. So maybe that's it. It's like you got to have a lot of patience and you got to be really protective as a shepherd. So that's supposed to teach. They're supposed to teach these leaders because Moses was a shepherd for 40 years. So he was 80 by the time that he gets called by God. Anytime you think you're too old for something, you're not. You're not. Jesus was, young, on the young end of things compared to most of the people in the Bible who are suddenly called to go do something. They're usually kind of old. Interestingly. Yeah. Like God had to pour a lot of wisdom in them first. So yeah. When it says that God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them, the very next chapter is chapter 3, and the title of it is Moses and the Burning Bush. So when God hears the groan, he calls Moses. It's like, let's go. Let's do it. And see, the poor Israelites didn't know that their prayers had been answered. That's another thing. The answer to the prayer was far away in Midian. And so they had to wait for God to impart that, and for Moses to get packed, and for him to travel all that way. And then he was going to talk to Aaron, and then we have to talk to Pharaoh, and he's going to say no. So it's kind of like a long process, but inevitable. I mean, it's like a huge stone rolling. There's no way to stop this, but it's not an instant thing either, because God was going to make an impression here. This is God's fifth symphony. I'm not going to call it the ninth symphony because the ninth symphony is later. But the fifth, the one that you're like, we are going to remember this forever. We're going to talk about it forever. And he's going to call it back to your memory all the time. So, yeah, we'll get into the different prayers of Moses next time, because God does a lot of talking with Moses and back and forth. There's a very, very back and forth relationship between the two of them. And so each one of those kind of break down. He asks a lot. Moses asks for a lot of things. I don't think a single thing that Moses asks for is denied him. So, and that's a whole long time. That's a really long time. 40 more years of asking and talking. So, okay, we'll talk about Moshe next time. And if you have any questions about anything, you can always put them in the comments. All right, see you next time.